Good morning and welcome to the first day of SuDS's Urban Drainage Group virtual training on sustainable drainage systems. And today's session will focus on SuDS and the water industry. So my name is Paul Shaffer and I coordinate the work on sustainable water management at CIRIA, the Construction Industry Research Information Association. I'm a fairly new recruit to the Urban Drainage Committee. I'm glad to say I'm joined by Elliot, Fiona, Jenny, and Karen from the committee. So they may be popping into some of the breakout sessions later on in the day. So those who aren't familiar with the Urban Drainage Group, welcome. And for those who aren't familiar with SuDS, another welcome. SuDS is a Royal Chartered Professional Institution representing a community of 1,000 of water and environmental management professionals and organisations across the world. SuDS's vision is for a safer, sustainable world. They're keen to work in an integrated way, bringing multidisciplinary skill sets to bear on the really knotty, multi-dimensional challenges that exist in the midst of the climate, nature, and sustainability emergencies we're facing. I'm going to ask Elliot, the immediate previous chair of the Urban Drainage Group, to say a few more words about the Urban Drainage Group. Elliot?
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Great. Well, a warm welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Just a few words about the Urban Drainage Group, its mission, and some forthcoming events and activities that may interest you. So the Urban Drainage Group is here to serve the entire urban drainage professional community in the UK and Ireland. So that's everybody that's involved in designing, modelling, operating, experiencing our urban drainage systems and how they affect our experience of flooding and river and coastal pollution. So it's quite a dynamic area. It's in the news a lot at the moment. I'm sure lots of you have been following recent news releases about storm overflows and the problems they're causing for rivers. So that is just the topic that Urban Drainage Group is really interested in. So coming up in the next few months, we've got a number of events. The first one is an event coming up in August, which is a conference over 2 mornings, and the theme is climate change and the effect that climate change has on urban drainage systems. If you have a look on our website, you'll see a call for papers just published for that event. So if you or your colleagues are working in this field and would like to talk to the industry and your peers and industry leaders on that topic, then please read those instructions and have a look. Later in the year, at the beginning of November, 9th to the 11th of November, we have our annual conference, which is a larger event. It'll be virtual, and there'll be plenty of opportunities within that event for panel discussions, workshops, breakout groups, and normal conference papers. So there'll be a call for papers coming out for that in the summer. So there's another opportunity. We're also currently receiving nominations for the WAPUG Prize. WAPUG was the predecessor organisation of the SuDS Urban Drainage Group, going back to the mid-1980s. And over this time, members of WAPUG have made significant contributions to the practice of urban drainage management in the UK, and this prize celebrates that fact. So there are some criteria, but if you're interested in reading about that, please look at the website. Finally, in the coming weeks and months, we'll be publishing a new integrated urban drainage modelling guide. That is an update on a document that we publish, which is around 10 years old, but that will have, and that's been, has a significant revamp by industry experts. So we're very much looking forward to publishing that coming up. A couple of ways for you to stay in touch with the group. One is through our Twitter page at SuDS UDG on Twitter. So lots of news and comment gets pushed out through that route. Alternatively, you can look at the website in part of the SuDS website or our LinkedIn group. So just search on LinkedIn for SuDS Urban Drainage Group and you'll find an active community there as well. Okay, well, I'm really looking forward to participating in today. And thank you to all the people that have spent many hours, I know, in preparation for this. I hope you, the delegates, will think it very worthwhile. Back to you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Elliot, and thanks for the introduction. So, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Great. So I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. And before we go into presentations and talks, it's probably a bit helpful to go through a bit of housekeeping. We wanted this virtual training to recreate the feeling of being at an in-person event. So if you look to the left-hand side of your screen, you will notice an area for sessions, networking, and of course the main stage where we are now. Like most things during lockdown, we're having to adapt to new ways of working. So today is a first for many of us, and we're all learning. So let's try and embrace the new world of hop-in and breakout sessions. And please do let us know how you find the experience so we can improve for next time. We'd like you to chat and post questions in the event and session chat to the right of the screen. Posting the event chat is across the whole platform, so everyone will see it. And intuitively, the session chat is within the session. So whether it's in a large practical session or a small practical breakout session, we were to see some of those chats that gets raised in the session. Any new information in terms of updates and posts and chats will be marked with a red dot next to the relevant tab. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties throughout these sessions, please contact the events team using the help desk in the sessions area, which is to the left, or by emailing them at events@sirem.org. We also have colleagues from Sirem's events team online, so please keep an eye out for Irina, Maria, and Roxana. And if you hear some strange voices, that's probably them helping us out as we go along during the day. So please do participate in today's sessions by responding to the polls when they come up, posing questions, and getting stuck in with the breakout sessions. After our speakers have finished their individual presentations, we have an opportunity for a few questions. And we'll also have a panel discussion, and then at around 11:40, we will have a comfort break and return for the second half of the event. We'll then move into the practical sessions. So please ensure that you've got the delegate briefing pack to hand for the practical session, which should have been sent yesterday through the email from Sirem and should be downloadable on the tab below. As I said, we really welcome your questions on the presentations, and please do use the Q&A function as we go along. And there will be a few polls coming through, and I'd like to start that first poll now on interest in SuDS delivery, and we'll give some feedback later on in the meeting. We will also close the session with some further discussion before 1 p.m, and you will then have the opportunity to take part in some speed networking. So over the next 2 days, we have a great collection of speakers and presentations covering a variety of aspects of SuDS delivery. And I really want to thank the presenters and co-facilitators for their time. I know how much effort they put into the presentations and preparing some of the practical sessions for you. So we hope you enjoy them. So why are we looking at SuDS? Elliot's already given a bit of an overview of the importance of the urban drainage group, but SuDS help us respond to a number of challenges the industry and society is facing. By mimicking nature, SuDS also provide a great opportunity to improve the quality of our natural and built environments. By responding to climate change, and SuDS can help us better respond to the challenges of growing flood risk and also deliver net zero carbon aspirations. There's also growing environmental pressures on ecology and water quality, and we have pressures on our urban infrastructure. So challenges around the sewer system and also around stormwater overflows. They're also increasing growing regulatory drivers for SuDS, and we will have an overview on that from Sophie later on this morning. There's also growing recognition of the value of SuDS as part of blue-green infrastructure in delivering multiple benefits, and there's a great opportunity to bring beauty back into our places and spaces. All the professionals involved in Urban Drainage Group are likely to be increasingly involved in the planning, design and delivery of SuDS. So today's session is about SuDS and the water industry. And Sophie, our first presenter, will discuss why SuDS are becoming of interest to water companies and what they're hoping SuDS will deliver. Kevin will provide a presentation to demonstrate what good SuDS look like and the importance of the design philosophy. And Chris will then go into a bit more detail about the design and construction guidance that's enabling water companies to adopt some SuDS components that can be classed as sewers. This should help SuDS become more mainstream as we go forward. So without further ado, it's now time for me to introduce you to our first speaker, and that's our keynote speaker, Sophie Tucker from United Utilities, who will be discussing SuDS and the water industry. Sophie sits on a national SIREM-convened SuDS policy and leadership group that has a strong interest and experience in SuDS and water reuse. Sophie had an integral role with the Northwest Regional Flood and Coastal Committee SuDS Task and Finish Group on the development of the Northwest SuDS Performer. Sophie has led on SuDS within United Utilities since 2015. During this time, she's assessed surface water drainage systems for adoption in accordance with the design and construction guidance that Chris will be talking about. This experience has informed the work that Sophie has led for Water UK to develop the water industry SuDS training. So before I just pass you over, we'd like you to think about some of the opportunities for asking questions at the end. There'll be the Q&A tab to be used, and we will have an opportunity for some clarification. So Sophie, over to you, and thanks.
Thanks, Paul. So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be invited today to the Urban Drainage Group Training Day to give an overview of SuDS and the water industry. And thank you to SIREM's Urban Drainage Group for hosting the event today. And it is great to see an event focusing on sustainable drainage systems, because as Paul said, we should all be involved in looking to do more. So what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what are SuDS, talk about the drivers for SuDS and why they're beneficial. Give a bit of an overview about SuDS in new development in terms of our role in adoption and some examples of good and bad practice that have been observed, as well as talking about delivering SuDS retrofits from what we'd like to see, a bit about the approach that we're taking, an introduction into asset lifecycle management, and an example SuDS intervention that's currently being developed. Next slide, please. So what are sustainable drainage systems? So on the left-hand side, I've copied the definition from SuStrain, which if you're not familiar with SuStrain, it's the place to go for all things SuDS. It has a great source of information, and it explains that approaches to managing surface water that take account of water quantity, water quality, biodiversity and amenity are collectively referred to as sustainable drainage systems. So as Paul's already given an insight to, they deliver multiple benefits. And on the right-hand side, I'm not going to talk too much about this because this will be covered in more detail in a later presentation, but it just explains that certain SuDS can be considered as sewers and therefore adoptable by water companies under the Water Industry Act. So in summary, if something is constructed to drain buildings and yards, i.e. the hard standing areas associated with those buildings, has a channel to convey and return flow to an effective and lawful outfall, it can be considered as a sewer for adoption. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the drivers for SuDS and why they're beneficial. Next one, please. So on the right-hand side, the industry have developed Big Question 6, which is around how do we achieve zero uncontrolled discharges by 2020, which includes those from flooding and spills to the environment. So this is part of the UK Water Industry Research Programme, and these questions are purposely ambitious for the industry, and reducing flooding and spills is of course a priority to us in the water industry. Then on the right-hand side, we've got the public interest commitment. So water companies do have a unique role. We run a vital public service for public good, but we are private companies within England. So through Water UK, all water companies within England have signed up to a commitment with a view to how do we do more to meet the high expectations which rightly come with our unique role as a private company, but delivering that public value. And I mentioned this as SuDS clearly provides a great opportunity to deliver multiple benefits to the communities that we serve. So it really does align with what's important to the water industry, our customers and society. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to highlight, United Utilities, we are the water company that serves the northwest of England. And at United Utilities, we're extremely proud to serve the northwest. Affordability is actually a real important issue for us and for many people in our region. The images on the slide show some facts and figures about affordability and vulnerability in the northwest and how we're providing help to customers that need it most. When I reflect on the last 12 months from the news, you could argue that we've been disproportionately affected. Therefore, for me personally, this further reinforces why we should look to deliver more SuDS. So Bath to Bay is a cross-cutting strategy for us to provide a reliable wastewater service. The image shown there is that for the drainage and wastewater management plans, which is the new way for organisations to work together to improve drainage and environmental water quality, providing the basis for collaborative and integrated long-term planning by water companies with other organisations. So it provides a visual showing how we take wastewater away from customers' properties through the network, which obviously includes pipes, pumps and overflows, to the treatment works before it's treated and returned to the environment. So when we think of our service, the role for SuDS can help us with challenges that we face in terms of sewer flooding as well as sewer overflows. So when we think of sewer flooding, our sewers, particularly combined networks, surcharge during rainfall. So there's opportunity to manage that rainwater in a more sustainable way, which will obviously help with that, but also it can help with our ability to freely discharge where we have separate sewer systems, because there is an increase in risk with climate change of hydraulic locking of our outfalls. And in terms of sewer overflows, if we can manage that everyday rainfall in a more sustainable way and have less of it discharging downstream to the drainage network, by managing it at source or within the site, then this would reduce the need to spill to the environment. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about SuDS in new developments and some of our experience in adoption. So this slide, I suppose, is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's, I've used the term expectation versus reality. Because the images taken from the Syria guidance, which you can see there, show high quality SuDS. However, what is being delivered, it shows the industry we are all still learning. It's currently more end of pipe attenuation, and you can see there, a pond within the corner of the site, an interpretation of a pond, I should say. You can clearly see it doesn't really appear natural. It looks a bit heavily silted and it's in the corner of the site. So I personally am of the opinion that stronger policy is needed to drive better and integrated design to maximise opportunities. Next slide, please. And just to share some recent experience, lessons and observations. So just to highlight that there is the Syria construction guidance, which has a wealth of information and shows a lot of photograph examples of good and bad practice. If you've not taken a look, I would definitely signpost you there. And the image that I've shown is quite a common issue where there's perhaps not appropriate sediment management within the design and perhaps not the appropriate longitudinal gradients as well throughout the system. So I've included an image there of a SuDS system in the Cheshire area, which shows it reasonably well constructed with a sediment forebay and low flow channel. But just focusing on the observations. So I've already talked about that, designs are typically end of pipe attenuation, and that makes them deeper components as well. So we've got to think about health and safety. They don't always look natural. And some of the products specified, you could argue, are they appropriate in terms of the inlet head walls, the fencing, all that sort of stuff. So and finally, consideration really does need to be given when planting is established. We have had some lessons on sites where the SuDS are constructed reasonably well. However, there's been a period of time where it's just left without any sort of landscaping, so it hasn't established before it's taking flows. Next slide, please. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about delivering SuDS retrofits. So if there's one thing you can take away from today, it should be that SuDS opportunities can be created almost anywhere. I am of the view that SuDS should not be delivered purely as projects focusing on drainage requirements. So as a SuDS advocate, one of the most frustrating things is the delivery of green infrastructure that misses the water management opportunity, i.e. the green-blue link. I've shown some case studies here, which I've also hyperlinked. And on the left, you'll see that there's an example pocket park in London. You'll be aware that there are tons of public realm improvements, and I feel there's a big opportunity here. So if we consider the public interest commitment, in many cases, the water industry, I'm sure, would be happy to contribute to such schemes if it delivers benefit through the removal and/or attenuation of surface water from the public sewer network. So on the right-hand side is Greener Grangetown. This is really interesting. The main driver for this scheme was actually around health and safety, with cyclists regularly involved in road traffic accidents. The location is adjacent to the River Taff. But what was recognised was the surface water runoff drained to the combined sewer, which was then pumped to the treatment works. And what was great here was opportunities were linked up, and it presented the chance to deliver a fantastic and award-winning sustainable drainage scheme. At United Utilities, we are delivering a number of SuDS in schools as well, and we hope to have our own case studies on SuDS training in the future. Here I've just shared our long-term vision in terms of surface water management. So it's just important to say that, particularly around retrofitting sustainable drainage, we are absolutely learning and we're building our capability to deliver more retrofits. And to do so, we really do have a huge dependency on partnership working if we want to deliver SuDS schemes similar to those shown on screen. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to our asset management decision making and how this can translate into projects. So you can see the bow tie diagram for our wholesale risk and asset planning. On the left-hand side, we have our risk inputs, so our operational risks through the tier processes, but then through the top-down sort of view, it's more of our strategic risks, which can also be fed by external pressures. And this can include the cross-cutting strategies like climate change mitigation, carbon reduction, natural capital, as well as the underpinning strategies like Bath to Bay, which I mentioned earlier. Then we have to make a decision in the context of the needs of our customers, the environment and our assets. What do we want to do, which then informs the interventions that we might look to do. That could be from monitoring and responding to operational interventions or partnership working, or even, project life cycle in terms of, do we want to refurbish something, replace something, or a new asset? So it's the asset management decision making that informs any project requirements at the start of a project when we're looking at delivering an intervention. And of course, all interventions are prioritised. We have to consider the value, considering cost, risk and performance, and of course the whole life cost of that. So as we build our capability, not only does this include identifying needs in partnership and the development of designs that include SuDS, but the delivery of supportable assets that we are confident to operate and maintain, with clear asset information that we can set appropriate maintenance tasks for the assets so they perform to realise the benefits that they're designed to deliver. We're currently developing some VSPs, which are smaller capital projects that include SuDS, but we hope through DWMP we can identify needs for major capital projects that can translate into SuDS solutions. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a partnership project that we're progressing. So it's a joint funded project for an area that experiences flooding from overland flows, as well as from hydraulic inadequacy within the sewer system. The opportunity to test partnership working and SuDS was identified here. And you can see from the image on the right-hand side that it's a reasonable size sustainable drainage system that's being retrofit there. So when we think about what we've talked about during the session so far today, if we think of outcomes of this project, it will be a high quality design. You think that actually it will enhance the landscape, it will create a nice space and place for the community, it'll deliver natural capital value, and it can help develop that community as well. So when we think of us as a water industry and we reflect back on the public commitment, public interest commitment and all other things, you know, it feels really positive that instead of just burying a pipe below ground that has little value to the communities, in some cases, SuDS can be the right solution to deliver those greater benefits. So on that note, that's just an insight to SuDS and the water industry. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sophie. Great presentation. So there's a few questions coming through. Delegates, please feel free to upvote any of your popular questions. So, and is it possible we could please run the poll? And while doing so, I will provide some feedback on the last poll. I think we asked about what is your main interest in SuDS delivery, and a large proportion, 44%, said SuDS understanding the required modelling, and then 21% said understanding the principles. And over these 2 days, we're probably going to more focus on the principles and how they can underpin working with water companies, and then how that supports the understanding of opportunities and benefits. But thank you for that. Right, so Sophie, so we've got our first question is, when adopting SuDS features as a water company, do you work with local planning authorities to ensure coordination of requirements? How do you do this in practice to minimize duplication or conflicts? And I think engagement is pretty key in getting these good outcomes. So I think it'd be, yeah, I'd be interested to see what the answer is. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's probably more to do in that space. We are doing a lot as well. I think you mentioned in the introduction at the start, you know, we, through our Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, the Northwest RFCC, we do have a SuDS task and finish group, and that has representation from the planning authorities, from lead local flood authorities, from United Utilities, the Environment Agency, and some highway authorities as well. And the whole purpose there is we've recognised, you know, you can argue that, you know, the policy and legislative sort of framework that we operate in, you know, there's a bit of a few challenges, if you like, with roles and responsibilities. So collaboration is absolutely key, and that's why we developed the Northwest SuDS Performer, to try and have a you know, an agreed view from the different flood risk management authorities and the planning authorities of information required. So as we say, we do have regular conversations, but we also recognise there's more to do in that space to continue to build. And it's fair to say, you know, we are on a steep learning curve as well since the introduction of the design and construction guidance. So as we're doing that, we're already reviewing some of our operating models and how do we sort of firm up relationships between adoptions engineers and people within the local authorities to have that, you know, better communication between the two parties. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope it gives an insight.
It's a thorough answer. Thank you for that, Sophie. And I think if there's some takeaway messages that we'd like delegates to go away with, I think it's the importance of that collaboration and early engagement. I don't think it can really happen quick enough or soon enough in that development and planning process to get the outcomes that we want. Great. Okay, so we might just be able to squeeze in a quick answer to the next question, if at all possible, Sophie. How are SuDS being prioritised as interventions in drainage and wastewater management plans compared to previous drainage plans?
Yeah, so we are looking at ways of how do we look to prioritise green infrastructure and partnership working, and obviously through that we'll help with the delivery of SuDS. The plan is very much in development. There's a lot in that space at the moment, so it's fairly embryonic, if you like. It's quite new and in development, but we are trying to do a lot which will help drive those outcomes. And I know we've got some workshops coming up with our partners to try and identify, you know, these joint sort of needs for investment and joint risks that will hopefully deliver these opportunities.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and also thank you for the questions and your answers, Sophie. That's been brilliant. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Great. So we're now going to be joined by Kevin Barton from Robert Bray Associates, who's going to be discussing what good SuDS look like and the role of a coherent design philosophy. Kevin is a landscape architect and director of Robert Bray Associates, an award-winning landscape architecture studio specializing in climate resilient and water sensitive design. Their projects seamlessly and inventively fuse water, people, place, and wildlife to create exciting and dynamic landscapes that come alive when it rains. So before I pass over to Kevin, please don't forget the Q&A and also the opportunities for uprating. And without further ado, I will pass you over to Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, thanks for describing me as living. I think you dropped in there. Yeah, so in this 20-minute session, I'm going to sort of expand on really the 4 pillars of SuDS: biodiversity, amenity, water quality, water quantity, which 20 minutes is quite a short period of time to cover all this. So I'll try and get the kind of essentials of expanding that into this sort of design philosophy that we developed for this training event. And so the first one I want to explore is really the major mind shift that needs to occur to shift from the conventional ways we've managed rainwater to SuDS and creating good SuDS development. And that's that we need to regard rain as not a problem to be solved, but as a valuable resource and an opportunity for people, wildlife, for better development. And this is something that's fundamental to our work. So since the mid-90s, when we discovered SuDS, the founding director, Bob, discovered SuDS, the practice has done nothing but landscapes that also manage rainwater. It's a bit of a eureka moment for us. So you can see in our designs here, we love designing with water. We love designing with the potential of what it does and what it means to landscapes. And yeah, interestingly, just this last weekend, I caught up with my brother-in-law who had been away to the beach holiday for a week over Easter, and described how the kids started digging around with a water flow, a stream coming across the beach and creating channels, and he totally commandeered the whole thing, and they created this sort of network of canals and pools and moats and sort of sculptures with sand, and yeah, described this sort of with excitement this sort of these sort of few days doing this on the beach. And I said, that's what I do for a living, that's my job. And it really does feel like that. It's so exciting to be designing with water in these ways. So this example of a retrofit project in Malmo, where lots of research has shown actually the benefits it brings to people to be managing rain in the landscape, as well as wildlife. So here, it's helped solve community cohesion issues, deprivation issues, health and well-being benefits to have an environment with water and biodiversity in it. House prices have risen. It's become a very desirable place to live. And now there's been subsequent phases of new development, all incorporating this sort of creative rainwater management. And it's a project of ours in White City, lots of opportunity for creating dynamic, playful, climate resilient landscapes. That's another kind of big issue for us, that we really employ SuDS to resolve in cities. And again, it's the opportunity of rainwater, by diverting rainwater to these landscape spaces that manage that rain. We can create incredibly resilient landscapes that are resilient to the droughts that we increasingly are seeing through the summer months, to create this sort of quality green infrastructure that can be playful and bring all these multiple benefits. And connect people with nature and the water cycle. That's something that's been sadly missing from our urban environments, is this lack of connection with rain and the water cycle. Next, the idea of mimicking natural drainage. I think this is really important. As we approach SuDS design, we're kind of thinking, actually, this is how our natural environment manages water, and we need to try and emulate that as much as possible. In a natural environment, lots of rainfall events don't even make it past the tree canopy. If they do get down to the ground, they're sort of they coat the surfaces of all the plants and the leaves. They soak into the topsoils. Eventually, they'll start sort of soaking into subsoils and sort of traveling through as base flow and interflow very slowly to streams and rivers. Pools will start to fill up in the landscape that may be topping up ponds and wetlands, but they might just be little pools that only occur when it rains. And so the landscape is holding that water in all these little micro pockets and pools. And then eventually, after a long delay, you might start seeing water traveling across the surface, clean, slow water traveling across the surface to streams and rivers. And whilst we recognize we can't live, you know, our urban environments can't be like the natural environment. You know, we need buildings, we need hard surfaces, but we need to make that urban fabric work really, really hard. We need to challenge every part of the urban fabric and ask, you know, can it manage rainwater in these ways that try and emulate these natural losses, the interception losses, the volume losses, the storage that we see in the natural landscape, the cleaning of that flow and releasing it slowly after a delay. That's what we're looking for our urban environments to recreate. And because we have buildings and hard surfaces, you know, we need to ask those parts of the landscape that are managing rainwater to work so much harder to try and mimic those natural processes. Another one that's really important is this idea of interception losses you might have come across. So this is about emulating and recreating what happens in nature in most rainfall events, where the first part of a rainfall event just coats the leaves of trees, coats the surface of plants, and soaks into that first bit of the topsoil and just rehydrates soils. So we call these interception losses. And the more we can use nature-based solutions and spread the management of water across our site as much as possible, using the urban fabric wherever we can to manage rain, then the more interception losses we will get. So something like this green roof will lose 10 to 15 mil of every rainfall event, which is more than 95% of rainfall events will just soak up into a green roof like this, 100 mil of substrate. Any pollutants are lost, but yeah, we've lost those interception losses, those at least the first 5 millimeters of rain will just disappear onto this green roof and won't drain away. So green roofs, blue roofs are brilliant. Things like rain gardens close to catchments like these building roofs and the hard surfaces around. Again, you know, the first 10 to 15 mil of rain will just soak into these features and you won't see them drain out through the flow control basket on the right hand side there. So most of the time the water will just soak in, rehydrate those soils. We're not relying on infiltration because it's on clay soil, but we will lose a lot of water in a system like this. And then eventually water will start traveling through the flow control onto the next part of the system. And things like, so we kind of, those are the sort of more nature-based solutions, the sort of soft landscape features of the green roofs, blue roofs, rain gardens. You can see another rain garden on the left-hand side of this school roof, which is taking the runoff from this plane of the roof. This plane of the roof travels onto the other side of the building and is managed in other features. We've got a rill in the foreground. All of this is losing water to the plants and to the soils. But then in the foreground of the school, this plaza area is all permeable paving. So again, an expansive feature. Even if this is on clay, it means we are losing quite a large proportion of the rain that lands on this surface. And if we can have 20%, if we can achieve 20% of our development area as SuDS features, we can actually take 5 millimeters off our rainfall data. So, you know, that's around, you know, 5% of our total volume attenuation requirement, which we can take off our calculations and save money. We want to maximize volume losses. So this is something which is kind of often missed. So when we develop a landscape, and even if we put SuDS in, particularly if we're using pipe to tank, pipe to pond systems, whilst we might be slowing the flow down with the flow control at the end of the system, ultimately we will be delivering more volume off that site to the receiving watercourses or sewers than would happen in that natural landscape. So we want to maximize ongoing volume losses through our system. And again, by spreading that management of water across a large surface area, using like the permeable paving on the right-hand side in the foreground here, rain gardens taking this roof runoff from a rain sculpture, this basin in the background, large expanses of pieces of multifunctional SuDS infrastructure, we can get lots of additional volume losses beyond that first 5 millimeters. We're holding that water in these landscape areas for long periods of time with slow flows through small flow controls. And it allows then lots of time for that water to disappear into the soils through infiltration, evaporation, transpiration. And in fact, this heavily monitored project showed that in the first year, half of all the rainfall that landed on, not only on the landscape that we were putting the SuDS in, but also the additional catchment areas like the roofs around that we took into the system, 50% of that rain never left the site, even though it's on a clay site. 50% of the annual rainfall just didn't leave. Again, spreading it thin, so there's no permeable surface in this landscape, but pretty much every piece of green infrastructure, every piece of soft landscape you can see here is managing runoff. So they've got a flush curb allowing water to flow off this impermeable highway area across a filter strip into a sunken planted basin or rain garden with trees in there to maximize the infiltration rates and maximize transpiration rates. This piece of little triangle in the background, you see that sunken down tree in there, that's also managing runoff on the surface. Every piece of green space, we've got swells running away in the background. So we're spreading that water out, using every piece of landscape we can to manage that runoff. And so the volume losses in this system are enormous. And again, we've got hard surface with a generous filter strip. So even as water travels across this filter strip, cleaning out those pollutants, we've got a lot of loss of volume into this swale, which is then a biodiverse swale, so not a mown grass swale. So that's the flow travels through there. It's traveling very slowly. Lots of adsorption onto the surface of those plants, lots of infiltration and evapotranspiration. It's traveling very slowly, so it's soaking into the ground. So we're losing lots of volume from the system. And we really want to reduce the risk of pollution, not only to the wider environment, but within the development itself. So yes, these kind of mass fish kills that we regularly see in our urban environments because of the cocktail of pollutants and the heat and the microplastics that wash off our urban surfaces, particularly in summer when the natural river levels are very low, and so there's limited dilution impact. Plus, you've got the heat from the urban surfaces, which means that the polluted runoff can carry very little oxygen. We get these mass fish kills. We have like an epidemic of misconnections in our urban environments because our rainwater pipes disappear into the ground and people don't know the difference. They assume it's all dealt with correctly. They plumb in a toilet, plumb in a dishwasher, and we have, again, urban waterways which are wall-to-wall sewage fungus, and you can smell from 20 meters away. Yes, we need to solve those problems through our SuDS design, but if we only focus on trying to clean that water before it leaves to protect the wider environment, then we fall into the trap of potentially having features like this, features that we're using the landscape just to remove pollution and protect the wider environment, but we create spaces within our development which are highly polluted, they're ugly, they're a maintenance issue, and so they're not hitting the sort of the other pillars of SuDS, the amenity and biodiversity. It's actually a negative amenity feature and it's a negative biodiversity feature. So we want source control features within our development that are removing those pollutants as close to where the rain lands as possible, as close to where those pollutants are mobilized from those urban surfaces. So things like permeable pavements, green roofs, bioretention rain gardens, filter strips, swales that are taking that pollution out early in easy to manage ways, and then protecting things like this basin here, which is a play basin in the heart of a housing scheme, so that this isn't getting polluted runoff when it rains, so it can become a usable landscape space. We want to manage water at or close to the surface. Our aim is to manage it at the surface as much as possible and minimize the water disappearing underground and bring it back as soon as possible. If we have to put it underground in a pipe, that the pipe is a connector between SuDS features, that the landscape is the network, the drainage network. The pipe system isn't the drainage network. It's simply a connector where we need it to go to a flow controller from one piece of SuDS system to another. But wherever possible, we're trying to manage the water on the landscape. If we do, we can create these interesting features like this swale maze in a school, which brings lots of benefits around play, amenity, education, lots of biodiversity opportunities, and we have then landscapes that kind of come alive when it rains. We have this sort of these dynamics of landscapes changing and people being connected to that water cycle and seeing things happen when it rains and understanding that the landscape is having this other life, this other function, and can see this sort of clean water regenerating a landscape, keeping it alive, even having sort of playful features that really make the most of this. We've got one case in White City where I saw a young boy take his mother over to one of the rain sculptures, and he understood that this visual effect on this rain sculpture only happens when the rain's hard enough, and it was only raining gently. And so he explained to his mum that it wasn't happening yet because it wasn't raining heavily enough. And could he come back later if it was raining more heavily to see this visual effect happening? In this science block, we had these sort of demonstration features of a water wheel and a tipping bucket and another feature around the other side to make this landscape come alive when it rains and keep this water flow at the surface and visible and creating this sort of dynamic landscape. One that's really important to us as sort of landscape architects, and should be to anyone working in urban design, is sort of, we need to be designing our systems to be benefiting local communities. And there's lots of opportunities that SuDS brings in terms of benefiting local communities. Here, 2 lanes of highway were put over to green infrastructure to manage runoff, but it's effectively created a park where there wasn't a park before, and people are changing their behavior. Getting off the bus earlier to walk through this on the way to school, using this space as an amenity space at lunchtime. But this is, an expansive SuDS system. It's managing runoff at the surface, polluted runoff from this highway across a flush curb as a sheet flow into this cascading SuDS feature. So it's a totally multifunctional SuDS feature which benefits then the local communities of Sheffield. The basin again in White City with then this sort of play opportunity. So what was a busy, polluted, dangerous route to school has become an adventurous, playful route to school that children and parents actually enjoy walking to school now, where they used to drive their car. And the sort of school drop-off and pick-up time, this is just teeming with children chasing each other through the grass or going along Wiggly Wall on bikes or scooters, and it's become a highly valued piece of green infrastructure for this local community, and has actually started bringing the local community together. In their words, parents are meeting earlier to chat to each other where they used to be making gestures through car windows and beeping their horns at each other. And to them, it's a landscape about community cohesion and all the benefits of green infrastructure. To them, it's not a SuDS landscape. So it's really important that we design with this in mind as we're designing our SuDS systems. How can they also benefit local communities? Air quality benefits, putting green infrastructure that is managing the polluted runoff through these little gaps in the curbs into a bioretention rain garden. We're putting then a piece of green infrastructure between the pedestrians who are walking on a permeable footway. We're putting this green infrastructure between polluting vehicles and vulnerable pedestrians, bringing obviously lots of air quality health benefits, but also a much more comfortable urban environment to walk through in what's actually quite a busy high street on White Hart Lane in the centre of Tottenham. Much bigger scale, we need to be designing to what's appropriate for the kind of landscape we're in. So if we're doing a big major highway scheme, kind of plain amenity and seesaws and balance beams, wouldn't be appropriate. We're not looking for that. Amenity might then be purely visual amenity of it looking nice as you're driving past. In a big urban plaza like this, where hard spaces and where a Muga would be appropriate, and in this university campus in Rotterdam by de Urbanisation, this Muga area, which is sunken down to allow seating so people can watch games and just hang out, also becomes this kind of amazing, huge basin with safe egress and access, and visual spectacle when it rains. Nearly there. Two more. Support biodiversity within development, really important. This part of one of the 4 pillars, and SuDS, almost without trying, can bring biodiversity if we use nature-based solutions. But with a bit of effort, we can really focus our designs on maximizing that biodiversity potential. So here's a swale, which is our final connection from the SuDS system at the school, which had the water wheels. This swale runs down to drop into a brook. So this is our discharge route down to a brook. Now that brook has this amazing natural wildlife corridor of its own, linked to, in this case, the River Severn. And so we've got this huge, it's connected to this wide biodiversity network. And this swale is the opportunity then to provide an at the surface, there's no pipe discharge into that brook, it falls at the surface with this biodiverse feature running, creating this corridor right up into the development. So the ability that SuDS has to bring biodiversity right up into the heart of development, rather than be something at the fringes or in a corner. And the ability to create wetlands are incredibly valuable biodiverse habitat features in urban environments. Obviously, we don't have to have wetlands and ponds in our SuDS, but there is that opportunity where we've cleaned that water. We don't want to be delivering dirty, polluted water, so we need source control. Where we've cleaned that water, we can then have biodiversity. And finally, you probably wondered where this one was. What we historically have focused most on, the flood risk. And yeah, obviously, that kind of catchment scale or local flood risk. Probably because I'm running out of time, and I think we've got a 3-minute lag, which would make the poll very difficult. I won't probably do the poll at this point. But just say that, yes, actually, obviously we need to do that. And actually, if we've done all the other things that I've talked about, the other kind of philosophies of the SuDS, actually we've achieved most of the kind of flood mitigation that we need to. It's actually then quite easy to achieve the sorts of volumes we're talking about. But there is kind of one sort of fundamental shift, which I think really helps us design in ways that allows us to exploit as much of the landscape as possible. And that is to think of not what volume does my whole development need to manage, but actually what volume does each surface, which each roof plane generate. And typically on most schemes, that is around 70 to 100 millimeters depth of rainfall that lands on every hard surface is what you will need to find space to store in the landscape. And if we break it down like that, as in, this roof plane generates 5 cubic meters, I can start finding a space to put a rain garden, and then a swale with attenuation in it, or a basin, and I can start finding spaces around the landscape that manage the runoff that comes from that particular surface, or that car park area, or that footpath. And this is really critical, and I think something that is often missed from design, and without thinking about, there's a volume that each surface generates. If we think of it like that, then we're less tempted to kind of resort to one feature or a couple of features down at the end of the system that's managing the runoff from the whole development. We need to think of it as each catchment, each roof space, each hard surface generates a volume of its own that we can manage in the landscape. And for our design, that's really, really critical. And most of our work is based on calculating those volumes that each space generates and finding little pockets within the landscape, integrating it in these multifunctional ways to take bites out of those volumes as it travels down the site. So we have then minimal reliance on land take to put a big basin down at the bottom. Cool, slightly over, I'm sorry about that.
Sorry.
Fire away with any questions.
Well, thank you for that. So before we do get into the first question, and there's a good one coming over, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that actually our biggest concern in the industry is really the end of pipe system and the big craters. So that the last point you mentioned about splitting up the catchments and spreading that volume across the site is really important about trying to secure good delivery. And there's a question here, and probably got time for one, is how do we encourage property developers who are mainly interested in profit to create innovative SuDS?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great one. And it's one we sort of bang our heads against a brick wall about constantly, because there's lots of evidence out there that good SuDS design can save a developer money. In fact, I think you've got in the package later on, there's a Lamdrove project in Camborne in Cambridgeshire, which was early 2000s project, which is one we designed for a conventional house builder as a pilot scheme. And until that point, the conventional house builder had only done conventional drainage without any attenuation or flow controls. And they compared the cost of the SuDS system, so the nature-based SuDS system we delivered without any extra land required. So we just used the green spaces that were part of that development. And so but then this landscape is providing all these added benefits of managing runoff, cleaning pollution, creating more interesting and biodiverse public open spaces. And that developer did their own cost analysis compared to conventional drainage, pipe drainage without any attenuation or water quality treatment. And it saved them around, it was around 10, 11% compared to conventional drainage without attenuation. So it's a kind of no-brainer. Things like blue roofs, I think part of the problem is the developers think that good design looks expensive, and it's hard almost to believe that it's going to save them money. But when you start comparing it to expensive tanks and giant pipes and all these expensive flow controls that are required for schemes of that sort of size, or land take, when you're talking about a basin at the bottom of the system, which is so deep and steep-sided, you can't really call it part of the public open space. And so it becomes fenced off, and the developer looks at that and thinks, I could have put 5 houses on that. That, compared to that kind of basic sort of approach, the integrated approach can look expensive, and it's hard. It's kind of sort of sometimes hard to imagine that that's going to save you money. Better things can actually save you money. And a great example of that are blue-green roofs. So on dense urban developments where you've got very little or no landscape to manage runoff in, quite often that runoff from land on the 13th floor is managed underground, so far from where it lands. And we had a project in Hackney where their assumption was that they would collect from the roofs and put in tanks. And we introduced them to the idea of low-tech blue-green roofs without plastic crates on there, so attenuating within the growing medium, very occasionally over the top of the soil surface. They costed adding all these biodiverse blue-green roofs to every roof in that development, and it saved the development £800,000 compared to putting it in the tanks underground.
Wow.
But a developer looks at those and they'll think, well, that's expensive. That's going to be expensive. The planners are asking me to do that kind of thing. There's lots of multiple benefits to doing blue-green roofs. It's got to be expensive. But when you compare it to what the alternatives are, these nature-based solutions, almost hands down, always come out
great,
more cost-effective.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think it's about that discussion around cost and benefits. And tomorrow we'll be looking a bit more about the benefits. So thank you for that. And thank you for that question. So now moving on to our last speaker, I just want to introduce Chris Patmore from WSP, who's going to be presenting on Ofwat's Code for Adoption Agreements and the Design and Construction Guidance. So Chris is a technical director at WSP. He has 30 years experience and specializes in flood risk and sustainable drainage design. As part of SuDS steering groups, he's been involved in both of the SuDS manuals and has also contributed to SuDSdrain website. And he's also been involved in the development of the construction guidance that Sophie talked about. More recently, Chris has been involved in the preparation of the design and construction guidance that replaces SuDS for adoption, and has also been assisting Syria and Siren with the rollout of training. He's currently delivering retrofitted SuDS schemes for a number of local authorities, and also been involved in a project in London and Old Street. So it's great that you could join us, Chris. If you've got 20 minutes to go through your presentation, and if you want to take it away, that'd be fabulous.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks to everybody so far for today. Yeah, I'd just like to run through a little bit on the legislative side of SuDS and some advancements in that, which complement everything that sort of Sophie and Kevin have been saying, but also gives it into the context of what the water companies are looking at and how that can integrate with planning, detail, installations, and getting it through on an actual site. I was quite interested in one of the polls that was put forward a little bit earlier, which was looking into the future. What do you think were the greatest impacts on how water companies deliver SuDS? And I noticed that probably the leading vote on that was almost tied between legislation and managing sewer flooding and flooding in general. And that's actually partly the driving force for the design and construction guidance. So some of you may be aware that sewers for adoption has been around for quite some time. And this background driver for flood risk management and to keep up with other legislation like the Flood and Water Management Act, the way that MPPF is trying to integrate a joined up holistic approach to planning. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, sewers for adoption was just really dealing with the pipe end of things. Put something in a pipe, and in a way that it was quite restrictive in anybody wanting to innovate and look at this SuDS approach. So sewers for adoption was revamped. For a short while, it was being muted as being sewers for adoption 8. And I have still heard quite a few people refer to it as sewers for adoption 8. It looks and has the feel of sewers for adoption, but it is within this new code of adoption agreements. So it's part of a suite of documents. And that's another thing that I'll just run through, is that ideally you don't want to concentrate on just this one document, but you want to look at the whole code for adoption as an entity. The other key thing about the new design and construction guidance is that it's now mandatory. So it may not be fully aware to you, but sewers for adoption, the previous versions, were still guidance. So there was some flexibility. There was a different approach between water companies on various ways of dealing with materials and construction techniques. The new DCG is now mandatory across all of the English water companies. There are some subtle changes allowed, but essentially, if somebody presents a design which is in accordance with the DCG, then, and it's presented for adoption, then the water company is obliged to adopt. So if we run through just basically some of it. So to accompany it and to sort of publicize it, there's been a few sort of white papers and a few little guidance notes. I've given the links to a couple of them that have come out since. Probably the leading one is the Water UK one, which is basically the people behind the DCG in the first place. Just gives you a quick overview of how it's aimed to be implemented and how it's applied. What it looks like, the DCG is actually part, as I said, of this code for adoption. And it's actually referred to as Appendix C of the code for adoption. The website link is here. And as I said, it's worth reading a lot of the other sections about how the adopted drainage network can be applied for, what the information is required, how the process works. Also in terms of a review system. Because what there is, because it is a new entire suite of documents rather than one, what they're looking at is, are there some issues with it? Are there ways that it's not being brought forward? Are there communication issues? Are there documents that are, just plain confusing or don't include enough information? So this process is built into it. So Appendix C is the design and construction guidance, which is essentially sewers for adoption 8. But basically what the main change from all the previous sewers for adoption is this massive step change into trying to address SuDS, trying to incorporate SuDS, but also doing it in a way that doesn't mess up the legislation or require additional legislation to make it function. So it's all worked around the existing Water Acts, the MPPF and the Flood and Water Management Act. So there's a lot of background to it. But essentially, we are still going through what is really something that Kevin sort of outlined, which is this hierarchy of drainage. And this applies across the board, whether it's building regs, whether it's the MPPF, whether it's the non-statutory technical guidance for SuDS. This is the sort of hierarchy that all drainage should be looking at. And the stages are generally, do you really have to release any surface water that falls on your site in the first place? Can you not use it for something else? Can you use it for grey water recycling? Can you use it for irrigation? Can you use it for anything else and not release it at all to the environment? If you have to start releasing it, then there's a sort of staged approach to look at the processes. So infiltration into the ground, lose it at source. You know, there are issues in some areas, particularly towards the south, where we're getting groundwater recharges not happening because of the amount of paved surfaces that have been built. So is there a way that can be improved in a safe and sensible, non-polluting way? If you can't do that for some reason, I don't know, you're on slightly contaminated land, or the clay soils are very difficult to permeate through. Is there a surface water body that's a watercourse or a lake or the sea that you could then discharge to, a natural feature? And then only then you start looking at the pipe systems, the sewers, the highway drains, or any sort of other public or private system that you can get access to. And then, finally to a combined sewer. And you'll note there's no definition of a foul sewer in there. So in essence, historically, the issue that we've sort of had is that planning has always been pushing for this hierarchy, but the adoption side of things has always been pushing for, well, we can adopt a pipe because we know what it is. We've designed them for years. A pipe is a pipe. We can adopt that, but all of these other SuDS features are all getting a bit sort of grey as to who takes over ownership, who operates them, who manages them, how do they integrate with a pipe system? Are there any issues in terms of cross contamination? Are there any areas that are now being drained that wouldn't be drained under the Water Act and various other things? So there was always this contrary pressure between the two. So what the DCG is trying to do is address that by looking at the definition of a sewer and how SuDS can be brought into the documentation, into the design processes, into the management processes in a way that isn't contrary to the Water Industries Act, and in a way that is understood and easy to disseminate and share. So basically, a sewer has to be a facility for transporting water that doesn't include land drainage, and it primarily doesn't deal with the drainage of roads. So as Sophie was sort of saying, it's to do with buildings and their major areas. So although under the Act, water companies aren't obliged to accept runoff from highways, there will be sites where there is a crossover and there will be elements of highway drainage that goes into a public sewer network. But it is generally through agreements and common practices that have been established between the join up between highway teams and the water companies. Land drainage is almost a bit more cut and dried in that water companies generally do not like the idea of land drainage entering the public sewer network. And this has historically been a stumbling point with sustainable drainage systems, where the interface between, is it draining land or is it draining a public area, that becomes a sticking point. So what we're trying to do in the DCG and the code is trying to get past that hurdle as well. So this is pretty much the same list as Sophie had on her first slide, which is that the definition of a sewer, and therefore the definition of an adoptable SuDS feature, is that it has to be draining buildings and the areas around them. So this is not the actual private individual drainage, but this is collectively the drainage of multiple buildings. It has to be a channel of some sort, that can be followed, defined, and easily discernible on the surface or below ground. It has to convey and return flows from a sewer or from a sewer to a surface water body, and it has to have some point or some discharge point which is lawful, and there's lots of reasons for that in terms of riparian ownerships, in terms of access, in terms of what the water company can then get to do maintenance and follow up. So it has to have a discharge point at some point on the network, the limit of adoption in other words. So if we look at a basin, so this image just comes out the SuDS manual. What I've just highlighted is what is something that I've certainly typically seen a lot of the time when the lead local flood authority or the Environment Agency or another body has suggested that, you or the planning authority has insisted that you do need to attenuate the site. And this goes back to what Paul was saying about the end of pipe solutions, is that they end up putting in a basin at the end of the system with a flow control in it. It takes all the drainage from the site, puts it into one place, but previously it's not adopted by the water company, so it has to be an offline system. And being an offline system means that there has to be an online route. And the issue with the online route is that that's generally a pipe network. It may also be a pipe network that's designed for the 1 in 30-year event, because that's what the previous sewers for adoption suggested it should be. And then what happens is that the flows for pretty much 95% of all of the rainfall events go straight down the pipe network and bypass the basin completely. So all of this multiple benefit, all of this treatment, this water quality is missed. Under the DCG, with the new definitions, what we can now look at is that the flow path is through the basin. The basin is now online. It's now fully potentially adoptable. And that means that every single rainfall event gets the chance to go through that basin. And on all of the things that Kevin was talking about the losses through the system, the infiltration, the evaporation, the take up by the plants and the soil, all of those things can happen to every single rainfall event. So what you end up with at the end is less volume coming out, less flow coming out. And in a lot of cases, you may not even actually get a discharge from the site. Whereas the previous versions, you will be getting discharge every time it rains. So that's one of the benefits of what the DCG can bring forward. So as an example, we have one here where this attenuation basin has this low flow channel built into it, where we have a discernible inlet and outlet. It becomes, under the definition of a sewer, it becomes a sewer and therefore adoptable under the DCG, providing all of the other design parameters are in accordance with sewers for adoption. So the SuDS manual, sorry. So in terms of health and safety, in terms of the biodiversity, the materials used, the side slopes, access, as long as it meets all of those criteria, which is in the SuDS manual, then it's an adoptable asset. What it means in a network of features, and if we're looking at a combination of structures, there are certain things which you can't define as a sewer. So the blue-green roofs, for instance, that Kevin was talking about, because they are within individual buildings, even if it's a block of flats, it's still classed as an individual building. That falls outside of the definition of a sewer. And in the same way, permeable paving and some storage tanks could be within individual properties, in which case they're only serving that property and they don't convey water from multiple places. They're not necessarily adoptable. Permeable paving also has this integral role as the carriageway itself. So if it was going to be adopted, we would be talking about highway adoption rather than water company adoption. Bioretention, mixed issues with what it's draining. So it's all to do with what it's draining. If it's draining highway, it will be a highway feature. If it's draining individual buildings, it would be private. But if it's draining multiple buildings and elements of highway, then you could wrap that into the adopted sewer network. And swales, for instance, historically, maybe on highways, they get adopted as a highway structure, but in an integrated drainage network, you could use that in place of the sewer connections to convey water from one place to another, and therefore become an adoptable feature. So there are new challenges for the water companies when you are essentially bringing the sewers to the surface. Is how do you delineate them? What we don't want to see really is swales with 1.8 meter high chain link fences with barbed wire on and life buoys every 100 yards or whatever. We want to see them integrated into the landscape. We integrated into the urban realm and become sort of transparent in how they function. Basically extend what Kevin was talking about earlier. So one of the things that needs to be considered is the delineation, the areas of adoption. In this particular example, it's fairly straightforward in that the swale occupies basically the space between the dwellings and the highway. So it's quite easy to sort of define that. If we look at another example of an underground drained swale, but this is alongside open space area, then you end up with this sort of area on the right of the screen, which is basically an area where there is no defined boundary between the drainage asset and the open space. And this is where historically perhaps the idea of land drainage interfering with the SuDS adoption came in, because if all of that area to the right was actually necessarily draining deliberately towards the swale, there could be some challenges from the water company as to the adoption of that asset because of the amount of land drainage it may or may not be accepting. So those are elements to be considered in the whole planning and strategy of the drainage. And what we want to avoid, again, and actually Sophie had the slide to the bottom left here, is this bomb crater thing that Paul was talking about, which was where the ender pipe solution is thrown in at the end of the site. The invert levels are pulled down because it's the only way to get all the pipe connections to work. Trying to store below the inlet to meet the sewers for adoption criteria for no surcharging, etc., creates these pits, which are of no real benefit to wildlife. They're no real benefit to amenity value. They're very hard to maintain in some cases, inaccessible, and a loss of open space area. And all of these things are sometimes the challenges that developers put forward is, if you do this, then that's a loss of public open space. So I want to minimize all of that, which is exactly what Kevin was discussing. What we want to do is bring it back into a more naturalistic, multi-purpose arena, which suits what planners are after. It suits this whole SuDS philosophy and strategy, and it will get that better urban realm, the better living experience that Kevin was talking about. But in the background, it would also give all of the water companies a lot of benefits, which they're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, because there's water pollution, there's uncontrolled discharges, we're having misconnections and all of that sort of stuff. If you've got a system that you can see on the surface, you're less likely to have those things happen. And one of the benefits of allowing the water to be lost in the system is that the downstream sewers which it might connect to are then going to be receiving less water than they would have been normally. And then you're releasing the burden on the treatment plants, the outfalls, the rivers downstream, and reducing the flood risk. So those are all well, it's all benefits. You know, as Kevin was highlighting, there's also the benefits of costs as well. One of the things not necessarily covered in this slide, and not necessarily a prime driver of the DCG, but worth mentioning, is this multiple benefit, in that even the water companies have carbon targets, air quality, pollution, amenity, and all that sort of other elements that SuDS can provide in the background. And a lot of drivers now that I'm certainly seeing for introducing SuDS into schemes is through things like air quality or urban heat island reduction. All not necessarily driven by drainage, but driven by other bodies, and funding and various other things can come from that. And in combination with the water companies can actually get better solutions. So one other part I'd just like to run through on the DCG is that this idea of variations and a monitoring procedure. So what the DCG tries to cover is the fact that there is likely to be regional variations in a few things, and it allows each water company to have, in essence, two variations in the design standards. And those variations are also published on the same website as the DCG. So you can see how these are uploaded. There's also, it's a very transparent system. So what you're seeing is that the water companies offer the amendments, then there's a adoption panel review of those amendments and a strategy and a recommendation, and then it all goes through Ofwat, and then those changes are then sort of logged as official changes to the DCG, etc. So there's been a couple over the last year. One of them is Thames Water, for instance, under the DCG as it's currently published. If you look at table D1, if you happen to read through that, and you take a look at the definition of the minimum offset distance from the wet well of a pumping station to a habitable building, and it's generally a foul pumping station. Under the DCG as it sits at the moment, it's 15 meters from the wet well. What Thames have been looking at is that they've put in the application that actually it shouldn't be 15 meters from the wet well. It should be 20 meters from the compound boundary, which is a completely different measurement, completely different offset value. But I suppose basically the lesson to learn is keep an eye on all of the elements within the DCG, what's changing, what's coming up, and be aware that there might be some regional variations. And this is one example. In terms of what the adoption panel is also doing is looking at errors, corrections, amendments that need to be made to the DCG. One example of this, which is currently going through the vetting process, is that when we were looking at the draft of the DCG, we maintained a depth for inspection chambers of 3 meters, which was from previous SuDS for adoption manuals. But when it actually came to the final version, it got amended to 2. So the adoption panel is now looking at reversing that back to the 3 meters, because a 2 meter depth for the inspection chamber was causing some issues with adoption areas. The companies involved, I mean, you probably all know who they are. All of the English water companies involved in this. And one thing that is definitely needed and that we're rolling out along with Syria, SIWEM and Water UK is that there's a training program for all of these water companies to bring them up to speed with what the DCG requires them to do, what it means to them, essentially how it ties in with planning. So I know that was one question that came up on Sophie's talk, was how the lead local flood authorities and how there's a communication between water companies Environment Agency, lead local flood authorities, internal drainage boards, etc. That is all being rolled into the DCG. It's sort of in there. One of the criteria is that water companies do not dictate the discharge rate that is acceptable into their networks. That is to be dictated by the lead local flood authority, because that is their role, and it recognises that. And basically, what we're running through is quite an extensive training program to do something similar to what we're doing today, but advising on them what to look at, what could be adopted, what can be integrated into their networks. So that is probably quite a brief run through of the DCG and what's in it. I mean, there's a lot more to incorporate in it, but I think basically, I think we can hand over to Paul for any questions on that.
Great, thank you, Chris. I think you gave, I mean, this has been in discussions for a couple of years now, and I think you gave a really good overview of the mechanisms that might be available to mainstream adoption of some of the components by the water companies. I think what I will do is I will ask actually Sophie and Kevin to join us, and I think we're probably moving to the overall Q&A session of this, because I'm conscious that time is slipping away. There's a question here that I think is related primarily to Chris's discussion around the design and construction guidance, but I think it's also generally applicable to other systems. Is how do you get a fully integrated SuD scheme on a site that is adoptable if highways and land drainage cannot form part of the scheme?
That is a good question, and I think probably Kevin and Sophie have had experience of that, in that, you know, there are rules and regulations around legislation in that water companies can only adopt certain things. What I didn't do in my talk was actually describe which elements they can and can't. I think that's something that we're going to run through tomorrow, later today. But because of this thing about definition of a sewer, there are things that they can't touch, permeable paving being one of them, and green roofs. So there is an element of the planners being probably the lead in integrating it, but then it's the delivery and the developers that need to be brought on board to maintain that all the way through, from the planning, which could be a different design, to what's actually built, which is another design. Great, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, may I come in on that, Paul?
Yes, please do.
So yeah, in my view, it is a challenge. You know, I think on one of my slides I was a bit tongue-in-cheek, and I used the terms, you know, expectation versus reality, and I think this is one of the problems. But if I'm entirely honest, in our experience, I don't think that's been a blocker to the delivery of those sort of high quality SuD schemes that we desire. Certainly in United Utilities, I didn't talk on it today because I focused on sort of new development in adoption, but we've recently just created a new role to try and have someone engaging in more of the strategic development sites, because what we did find was the large development allocations where there's thousands of units associated with a site, so say like a garden village, it absolutely needs, you know, the water company, the lead local flood authority, the highway authority working together. Because if you do just focus on ones that come within a definition of a SuDS, you know, definition with a sewer, it is of course challenging. And we have had sites, you know, myself, I've previously done a role where I've technically assessed SuDS for adoption as we were building our capability in anticipation of the adoption code coming in around sort of 2016-17. And you found on certain sites that you'd have a swale that could come within the meaning of a sewer, and they'd be daylighting a section of culvert, would look very, very similar, but we could only adopt one of those components. So it absolutely shows that it needs that sort of joined up view. But what I would say now is that early engagement is key. And certainly within the Northwest, you know, we're trying to have sensible conversations and take a pragmatic view and encourage, you know, we'll adopt in cases where it comes within the meaning of SuDS we can, but we've also want to encourage our local authority partners to adopt more as public open space, as well as, you know, the highway engineers to start considering things like bioretention. So it takes a level of sort of pragmatic, taking a pragmatic view and working together in collaboration. So that's my experience to date.
Thanks, Sophie. And Kevin, what's your experience been about trying to integrate land drainage and highway drainage and to deliver a good SuD scheme? And I suppose it's the discussions that you've had as well with the lead local flood authority in terms of ease of adoption and maintenance maybe going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably most of the clients we work for, because we focus so much on nature-based solutions, they're so easy to maintain that a lot of our clients would have some kind of maintenance in place for their general landscape. And actually, you know, all of our schemes are maintainable by caretakers, by normal routine landscape maintenance staff. And so actually, we haven't had a scheme that there's been a desire to pass that over to a third party. So things like housing associations are quite happy to keep that land management, that general maintenance. And, you know, those maintenance staff are quite happy strimming a meadow basin or a piece of green infrastructure. So the biggest challenge we've had is then getting highways to get their heads around permeable paving. But I think it's really important that we do challenge that every time we get that kind of that closed door, is to try and kick it down.
and I know that's something
we have to challenge it every time, because it's not going to change if no one challenges it. So every time we come across that, we have to put the case, try and get then those other people within the councils, the LLFA, who they want to see it happening. So it's kind of got to come from multiple angles that people are pushing the highways authorities. So you need to get your head around permeable paving, and ideally get them talking to other authorities that are adopting permeable paving.
Exactly.
Engineer, share experiences.
And I think that's where that's what SuDS is trying to do in some of the events that are likely to happen later in the year, is trying to bring highway engineers to talk to highway engineers to say what the art of the possible is. So thank you for those answers. Next one is really about SuDS for small spaces and what can be done in terms of retrofitting. There's a question on there about what can individual householders do, but I also think there's another question about what can be done in terms of retrofitting in dense developments. So Kevin, could I ask you to kick off with that one first, in terms of small scale retrofitting and maybe something a home wouldn't mind doing?
Probably the biggest thing is to really separate out retrofit from new build. And new build has this onerous but quite sensible target of the 1 in 100 plus climate change rainfall event, attenuating that back to greenfield runoff rate, or for either Q-bar greenfield runoff rate, or from 1 in 1 to 1 in 100 greenfield runoff rates with long-term storage, and that's totally appropriate for new build, where you have that flexibility of a design to build in that attenuation and such. For retrofit, I think we've come across projects where we've had a brief and the target is the same, 1 in 100 plus climate change. And for retrofit, you have so many more constraints that actually, we talk about the art of the possible when it comes to retrofit. What's appropriate for the kind of budget you've got available and the sort of space you've got available and the constraints you have? What can you do? Because actually the vast majority of benefits of SuDS, the vast majority of rainfall events are managed in small features like rain gardens, permeable surfaces, and retrofit. If you've got lots of space available, then yes, sure, aim for the 100 plus climate change, but just aiming for 10 or 15 mil will get the first hit of pollutants. It will mop up that first flush from pollution from surfaces. That will be 95+% of rainfall events managed right there in features that you visibly see fill up and drain down. So whether that's, if you're doing an extension, make sure it's got a blue-green roof on it, a rain garden, rain planters, so raised sort of features that have attenuation underneath the sort of the soil layer, drop your rainwater pipe into that. So those sorts of disconnections and simple features like rain gardens, really easy to do. Repaving, if you're repaving a driveway, putting permeable surfaces in there, and then it opens up opportunities for those to be about climate resilient gardening, so you're not having to use as much tap water and hoses to keep your landscape hydrated, or creating little biodiverse features with little micropools inside rain gardens, or whatever you do with that rainwater. Those same kind of opportunities we talked talked about apply in that sort of smaller scale as well.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And Chris, you've been involved in some retrofit projects. What's the smallest scale that you've delivered? I
suppose the small scale is my own house, yeah, where I've got exactly what Kevin's described. I've got a bioretention box outside the window of the office, which the existing downpipe was disconnected and goes through. And then the overflow from that is then a perforated pipe that goes around the side of the drive to water the plants in there. So it's completely disconnected it. So that's probably the smallest one that I've done. The other ones, mainly for highways authorities, but under the Lead Local Flood Authority remit, are highways driven ones. But no, but actually only one of them was actually because of a sewer flooding issue. The tiny sewers that they were connecting into, they were putting in as many as they could afford along the road. And exactly what Kevin said, there was no way that they could retrofit for 100 plus 40% climate change. It was a case of what's the budget, what's the space, how many utilities are in the ground, because that's a big constraint on putting anything, changing anything is how many CCTV cables have you got or whatever you got under there. And other ones we've done in London recently were done because of air quality. And another set that we've done, the driver was an EU grant for treating an urban heat island effect.
So Paul, just quickly on that as well, in terms of small scale, the work that we've started to do with schools in certain areas, usually where it's close to where we've got, we've identified a need and the possibility of doing an intervention as part of our hydraulic flood risk reduction ODI, which, like you said, Kevin, it might not necessarily offer the full level of protection, but it's providing a better level of protection to what they have currently. But we've linked some SuDS for Schools projects with those needs, and the idea of that as well is we're working quite closely with our comms and educational teams in terms of how do we inspire the next generation to take some of that learning home. So by installing the things like the the SuDS planter boxes and diverting the rainwater down pipes off the roofs, we're developing some content in terms of homework. How can they go home and do their own little audit of their house that they live in, and how could they consider what interventions they could do? Because I think it's really important that we do challenge ourselves to do things differently, and that's a great opportunity to try and get people to look at their own homes and see what they could do as individuals.
And there's a number of initiatives coming out from Rivers Trust in that regard. So the South East Rivers Trust is doing quite a lot of really great work with regards to SuDS for Schools. And if you look at social media, look for the Rivers Trust, you'll be able to see the work that they're doing. But I also just want to flag up the fact that myself and Kevin were involved in producing some guidance for the Greater London Authority on reimagining rainwater, and they look at retrofitting a number of different building types. So there's 6 of them, so I might get it wrong. So there's schools, social housing, hospitals, offices, and parks and green spaces that we did. Did I missed any? No.
I think that was 5, but I can't remember what
the last one.
Retail, that's it. Sorry, yes, it was retail. Sorry, and I probably forgot that because it's the most difficult one to actually do on the ground, because the majority of the retrofitting was done on the building in terms of blue, green roofs and green walls. So that was quite tricky. Recognizing we've only got a few minutes, so if I could ask maybe for a couple of words from each of our panelists to say, how do you think SuDS are going to change in the next 5 years? So if I ask Kevin, maybe.
Yikes. Well, considering, and I asked this Bob, the founding director of this question kind of quite regularly, he started this in the mid-90s, and I think if you'd asked him where we'd be in 2021, it'd be a lot further on than we are now. So without being pessimistic, I think 5 years' time, unless there's some drastic stuff shifts, we're probably not going to be much further on than we are now. I really hope that's not the case. But I think lots more retrofit. So we're saying 50% of our work is retrofit SuDS, led by councils or environmental charities and stuff like that. And I think we'll start seeing a lot more of that. People demonstrating good SuDS outside of new development to show, how it can be.
Yeah, we see that through the case studies. And Chris, do you next 5 years, pessimist?
Maybe a little bit more optimistic than Kevin. I mean, the DCG is a big step forward, but it doesn't address everything. But it is a step forward. But it's only been out for a year, so there's not that many sites that have gone through. The retrofit thing certainly is coming forward in a big way. But I'm certainly seeing a lot in the background about this end of pipe solution being not favoured by lead local flood authorities or planning authorities or landscapers or anybody. So there's a big driver in the background to get rid of that way of looking at things.
Yeah, and
so I think the more sort of garden city thing is potentially going to lead to better solutions for that.
And there should be a DEFRA report coming out, recommendations to update the non-statutory technical substandards, which we talk about multiple benefits. And Sophie?
Yeah, I am quite optimistic, to be honest. You know my background, formally I've sort of led on sustainable drainage as SuDS manager within United Utilities, and now I've sort of stepped into my new role as area engineering manager. And one thing I'm pleased about is, for example, adoption has been stated as one of the biggest blockers. Personally, I don't think it is the biggest blocker. We have a solution to that in some respect with the DCG. But what I'm really pleased about is I feel like now the industry is starting to appreciate and understand how would systems, tools, processes, the way we work need to be adapted in order to, to really try and mainstream more SuDS retrofits. And I'm quite optimistic with the introduction of the DWMP and hopefully, delivering a lot more partnership work, and that we can start to realise a lot more of these opportunities and actually translate them into schemes that are delivered on the ground, that we can have some great case studies. So yeah. I am quite hopeful. I keep saying in AMP7 we're building our capability, and then in AMP8 hopefully we'll have a lot more to show. So brilliant. Fingers crossed.
Well, thank you for those responses. I think there's a mixture of realism and positivity there as well. So that's great. So thank you for that. And also thank you for your presentations, and thank you to the delegates for the questions. So we've now got a short comfort break, an opportunity for you to stretch your legs, get a tea and what have you. So can we ask you to please return at 11:50, and we will take things forward from there and look at the practical session. So thank you very much, and see you in a few minutes' time.